Welcome back to the Eagle Insight Podcast. Today's guest is Charlie Black. He's a great friend, and I've known for a long time from our time in Special Operations Command together. And Charlie's now the CEO of Xundis Global, which is a bespoke advisory firm. As interesting as he is, a retired Marine Corps infantry and special operations officer with a fantastic career, it's a bit unusual. And I don't think he followed a regular track in the military. I think he did things that were much more interesting than your average Marine. But he's learned a lot from that, and now he's bringing that expertise to the private sector. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Dude, I love learning about your career as I got to know you over the years, and I would love for you to share some particularly challenging or rewarding experiences that you had in the service that sort of shaped who you are and how you got to now.
Well, that's a tough question. We could talk about this for hours.
We can.
Yeah. I think that so for the readers or the listeners out there, I started as an enlisted Marine. So I enlisted during the Cold War. I wanted to go fight communism and do all that kind of good stuff, and went to Parris Island. I was transformed into a Marine. Later, shortly thereafter, began college. So I was in the Marine Corps Reserves. With the intentions of becoming an active duty Marine Corps officer. I came from less than modest background, sort of needed money for that. But also wanted the experience of, going to Parris Island, right? If you know Marines, it's a special place that you only want to go once. Anyway, during college I was activated and I got sent to the Gulf War at that point I was like a squad leader. I was an E5 sergeant. Very humbling experience. I was very excited to go do the thing that all of us in the military think we want to do until you actually go do it, and then you realize, wow, people trying to hurt you is a pretty serious thing. I was very unprepared for that, not from a leadership or a skill perspective, but organizationally, coming from the reserves and then thrown into this big war. Or at least I thought it was a war. It was 72 hours long. Compared to later experiences, it was really like, a little blip on the screen. But to your question, what I learned is I was not being effectively led and developed as an individual. And so that planted in me a seed that later when I became an officer, if that day were to come, what would I do differently, right? Which goes to, we've heard the mantra, servant leadership, that sort of thing. I realized that it wasn't about me at a very young age. Up until that point, I was pretty much about me. I was a 21-year-old young man, single, going to fight for your country, and then, it all changes.
So there's something really interesting about starting off as an enlisted Marine. Because if people haven't read your bio yet, and they should, is you became an officer, then a senior officer. You were a pioneer in Marine Corps Special Operations, and now you have a PhD and the CEO of your own company. When we look at the entry-level soldier or the entry-level worker within our organizations, you don't know what you're getting. Sometimes you've got somebody who is going to be a foot soldier, loves to be a foot soldier, will always be just a foot soldier, and there's nothing wrong with that. But
or a future CEO.
Or a future CEO. Exactly. There's the whole spectrum of people within your ranks. And as leaders, when we look down in our ranks and we go, okay, who do I have here? Who should I invest our time with? How much mentoring can I give young troops? Because I don't know which of these are going to be a CEO. Which one of these is going to be a pioneer for U.S. Marine Corps Special Operations?
Yeah, I mean, back to my experience, I think if someone was looking, they would have known that at least I had aspiration and willingness to learn and to grow. And that's really, there was a gap between my desire and what was being met, which stood with, that really did plant a seed that I tried later to make sure I filled that gap.
How do you advise leaders that are looking within their organizations about where they should be spending their efforts in terms of identifying future leaders within their organization?
In our current advisory work with companies, and they're usually mature companies, but less than $150 million a year revenue. So between 50, 150 million, that's sort of the range that we work. We usually engage initially with the senior leadership team, but then very quickly talk about not positional authority, but how do you identify the individuals within your organization that have unrealized potential. And everyone's not the same. And as you said, some people are perfectly content with being a foot soldier or doing that one particular job for 20 or 30 years. Others, their purpose is deeper than that current position. And so I think there are signals for that. You just have to be looking for those. And you can test those opportunities by giving those people a special project or something. And it's not that much of a cost in order for you to do that. And you can kind of get a feel for like, yes, my senses were correct on Bob, or no, they were not, right? I mean, I think you would agree that in your military time, every single one of the individuals you're responsible for don't have equal potential or desire,
Right.
right? And so most of those people do communicate that they want something more. And I think when those people leave a company, we should be wondering why, or why people leave a company. Sometimes I think it's because of that gap.
So, Charlie, you once told me that one of the bigger problems that organizations and leaders often have is underinvesting in their people. So, like, I think a lot of leaders are afraid to invest in people. They're not sure, if I put investment, whether time or money, into people, that they don't know it's the right people. What do you tell them?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're going to get some of it wrong, but you're going to get more right than wrong. Helping another human, even though they might leave your company in the future, is not the end of the world. You're still going to get a return while they're there, right? But more importantly, the 1 or 2 out of 10 that you invest in, who might be that future CEO, that critical individual, the return on investment is very difficult to measure. I think if you get out of your office and get out from behind your desk and get out with the people who do the work that your company does, you'll figure it out pretty quickly who's who.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's some hesitancy from leaders to move people into challenging assignments because they're just not ready for those assignments yet. And I always tell them, look, I was probably underqualified for every job I had in the military. It took me sometimes 30, sometimes 60, sometimes 90 days to really understand what my job was and to really start operating at a high level.
Right.
So the institution takes some risk in putting underprepared people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I partially agree. I think no one's ever ready for their next job, right? The first time CEO, it's the first time that individual's been a CEO, right? I mean, it's easy to say I'm ready to be a CEO, but you've never been a CEO, or I'm ready to be a battalion commander, but I've never been a battalion commander. I think that you will flourish where you're planted, and if the system, the company, and the social group, your boss, your peers, you have a support network, and you're humble enough to know what you don't know, then I think you'll be able to succeed. Because it's really not about you as the leader, right? It's about the individuals that you're charged to lead. And many times they have the solution if you ask the right questions.
Yeah, I think you're right. Asking the right questions and having that level of humility is essential to that. Now, I think you had something in your career where you got handed something unexpected and pretty big that you had no prior experiences, and that's when you were selected to command a recruiting outfit.
Yes. So in the Marine Corps, and it's still true today, to get selected to lead a recruiting station is a pretty prestigious thing. There's a board of general officers who select you. In fact, statistically, I think it's harder to get a recruiting station than like an O5 battalion level command, and one leads to the other in most cases. But nobody wants to do that, right?
Right.
I'm an infantryman. I know how to do that. I've spent the last 12 years being an infantryman, and now you want me to go do recruiting. I don't know anything about recruiting, right? So I had just come back from Afghanistan and an immediate deployment right after that. So in the summer of 2003, I deployed twice right at between 9/11 and that point, combat deployments. And then they're like, "Hey, Charlie, I got a job for you. And I'm like, awesome, I'm going to go to this other cool job. And they're like, you're going to take recruiting. And I was like, wow. So I showed up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was responsible for all enlisted recruiting for the state of North Carolina, active duty reserve, as well as officer procurement, officer recruiting, we just use a different word. Um, it is to this day the hardest job I've ever had. And it was the hardest job I ever had because I didn't think I was prepared for it. I didn't have any knowledge. So I had to sort of reframe my own expectations about what it means to be a leader. As an infantryman, I know all the weapon systems. I know how to employ them. I can teach all of that. When I got to recruiting duty, I was responsible, but I knew nothing other than you're responsible. Like you're in charge.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the institution taking a chance like that. They're managing risk by saying this leader has potential and can learn the job and maybe isn't 100% pre-assembled when they take the job, but we know that they are the kind of person that can grow into the job and succeed at it.
Right. And so, like your previous question, you could do the same thing in your company, right? You could find an individual who maybe they're an IT person and they work in the IT department, but they've demonstrated leadership to influence and inspire other people, and you can invest in them and position them in a completely different role within the company that has nothing to do with IT. Um, in many of the companies that I work with, that would be seen as heretical to do something like that, right?
Right? Yeah, I mean,
Um,
you've got to be an expert at this particular industry in order to be a leader in it, and I'm not sure that that's actually true.
I definitely agree that that's not true. What I found on recruiting duty is I was like, okay, I know nothing about the process and the techniques and all the, but what I did know is I knew what it meant to be a Marine, and I knew the basic fundamentals of leadership, which you and I both know. The fundamentals are easy to understand, difficult to enact on a consistent, disciplined basis. Um, every morning I looked myself in the mirror and things were not going well in my first 15 months. The recruiting station I had taken over had had some uh, major disciplinary action before I got there, so I was short recruiters. They weren't achieving the mission. So it wasn't as if I walked into a functioning organization, it was not functioning. And so what I chose to do was not focus on the details of the policies. I focused on what does it mean to be a Marine, and then I got out into the community and just showed ourselves. Here's who we are. Here's what we're about. If you want to be one of us, come try. I didn't try to convince anybody to become a Marine, and that's in the Marine Corps recruiting. Some were like, "Well, that's not how you do it," and I'm like, "Well, this is how we're doing it." We were at war, right? This is 2003 to 2006. Young men and women were coming home in body bags to Camp Lejeune and to then Fort Bragg every week. Kids that I had was responsible for recruiting in my first year gave their life during the time that I was there, and I was going back to the same schools. Um, so, if you're honest and direct, I've told many a parent, "Yep, your son or daughter, if they enlist, if you sign tonight, they are going to Iraq or Afghanistan. 9 out of 10 chance." And they would be like, "Oh my goodness," and I'm like, "But they'll be the best led, the best trained, and your son or daughter knows why they want to do this." And it was very humbling. I found that, I guess, the GWAT generation, as they call them, remind me a lot of my grandfather and the Greatest Generation. Um, really understood the gravity of what was happening, which made my job easier. But every day I looked in the mirror whenever there were shortfalls, and was I the problem? Usually I was the problem, right? My own thinking, my own assumptions, my own inability to learn something or to let go of something. And so I acquired some skills during those 3 years that I've benefited greatly from since then.
Yeah, you've talked in the past about learning and the ability to learn faster than the people around you,
Hmm.
and then you distinguished whether or not you're learning something new or you're relearning something, or if you're in a situation where you need to unlearn something.
Yeah.
And that, to me, when you talked about that, when I was a younger officer, and you were talking about what is it we need to unlearn in order to be successful here, that was so incredibly important to the way I started thinking about problems.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that in general, at least, individuals our age, and this probably holds true with our children, they're taught, at school that the world works a certain way, and if you do these things, and this is what the outcome will likely be. I think we all know, at least most people's belief in that was shattered with COVID, and we realized the world's a lot more complex than that. Um, and so I think, and I use my daughter as an example. She's a senior in high school, and I really focus on the learn, relearn, unlearn as a cycle. So you have to acquire new knowledge, but you also have to recognize that that knowledge might have a life cycle, right? It could get displaced by new science, might disprove it, right? I mean, there was a long time ago we used to think that the sun circled the earth, right? And then we realized, no, no, we circle the sun, right? And we're all moving through time and space as the universe is expanding, right? Um, so the learn, relearn, I think is most people can get that. I think the unlearn is the hard one.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree. I think that's very difficult to recognize the things that you have held to be true for a long period of time that are no longer serving you, either because the information is outdated or superseded, or because it was wrong in the first place, but
oh
was
yeah, there's
useful
some of that,
anyway.
right? Sometimes you believe you were successful for a particular reason, but in fact, the thing you're holding on to tightly has nothing to do with your success. It's something else, right? Um,
Yeah.
or as you said, um, your success is tied to that belief, and in some cases, your identity. And so it's very hard
Yeah.
to unlearn because if I unlearn that, then that means who am I? And what about my 25 years of experience? And you're like, those 25 years experience was wonderful, but tomorrow is different and you have to learn some new things, right? So I think for
Yeah.
companies, this investment in people and learning and relearning from a process perspective um, would be useful, particularly with the Gen Z and their lack of a long-term idea of working for one place for a long time. So companies still have these beliefs that they're going to hire them and they're going to be there 30 years later, right? And they're not, right? They're not going to be there in most cases. But the one or two out of 10 that you pick who have aspirations to be something more, you can find them a pathway and you can hold on to them. Nothing wrong with the other eight, right? Some of them might stay 10 years, some might stay 3 years, right? You wish them well. It's not treasonous to leave the company. Um, it's just the modern world, the world that we live in.
I, I think because change is happening so fast that the learning, relearning, and unlearning is a very fast cycle for us now, and identifying what are those things I have to unlearn, what are those things that are
Mhm.
no longer serving my purpose or no longer serving my company. I've got to be able to identify that quickly and unlearn that. But the backside of it is also what are those things that I need to hold fast to? Francis Hesselbein talks about change being inevitable, but the first step is to figure out what doesn't need to change.
Right.
And what she's referring to there is the values. Like when you're going to change something in your organization because the market has shifted, great, let's go after that. But let's never forget who we are. And I think the Marine Corps, and your approach in recruiting is like, okay, we have to change how we're talking to people. What we don't need to change is who we are and what the values of the Marine Corps are.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Bob. I think that a lot of the companies that I work with haven't, yeah, they have some vision statement and they did some little offsite and they talked about what you just said, but it's not been internalized and infused into what I would call culture, meaning what are the acceptable behaviors And why are those the acceptable behaviors? Because company A believes X, right? That's why we do. You're the new employee and you're like, Charlie, why do we do X? And you're like, well, there's a couple other ways to do it, but based on our belief in our values, this is the most congruent with who we are. And so we choose to do this. Even though this might be more expensive, even though this may not be quite as effective, but we can sustain this in the long term because everybody's aligned because of that value, right? And I think that far too many companies overlook thinking about who are we, what's our purpose, what's our value, and they jump. Because I don't, at least in my experience, for the last 10 years or so in the private sector, the companies I interact with, the preponderance of those that have come out of the B schools have very good skills, whether it's supply chain or finance, but they're lacking in this piece, the human piece.
Yeah, and those things I think are difficult to teach in a classroom environment. I think one of the we talk about skill acquisition as a coach. I started off my first coaching was as a youth soccer coach, but the fundamentals of teaching people things is still the same. And there's this 70-20-10 rule. It's 10% of the skill acquisition is seeing or learning or reading about the skill. 20% is expert feedback, and 70% is just doing the damn thing. Mm-hmm. And I think leadership, to a large extent, the people skills part of that is doing the thing and being open to the feedback. I mean, the 10% learning piece, yeah, there are some techniques that you can absolutely learn, and those are useful. But you got to just get some repetitions in there with feedback so that you know you're doing it right. And when you're doing it wrong, pay attention.
Right. I mean, look at the companies or how many companies when they say, "Hey, our people are our most important people," and then usually I'm like, "Hey, show me your budget. Show me why your people are the most important. Like, show me that that's true. Have you sent them to any? Do you do tuition assistance? Do you send them to any training courses?" And I don't mean compliance stuff like an IT certification. I'm talking about leadership training. And usually the answer is, well, we sort of do that in-house. And I'm like, but you're saying it's the most important thing, but you're not actually doing it, right? So the say and the do, there's a gap.
Yeah, and the say-do gap is, I mean, it's one of those things that you get feedback on in the military right away. Right. If there's a gap between what you stand for, what you say, what you espouse that you stand for, one of your peers or your platoon sergeant or your boss, somebody's going to call you on it.
Or a subordinate.
Yeah.
Even worse. How embarrassing is that?
Yeah, they'll call you out. And leaders. Most leaders like to learn. None of them like to learn in public, especially with a subordinate calling them out.
But do you think that that's part of the reason in the military culture that's an accepted behavior, right? It's infused that people are going to call you out. My own experience for 3 years as a senior executive is that was not acceptable. It was viewed as hostile. Rather than, even though I'm giving feedback in a way to help an individual's performance improve, help them individually aspire or to attain a goal, it was seen as too intrusive.
Yeah, I think there's some leaders that believe that disagreement is disloyalty. And if you're not just nodding up and down and saying, yes, sir, that you somehow have a loyalty problem to this command and to me personally, and so I'm going to take that out on you. I'm going to correct your disloyalty, right?
Right.
On the other hand, you have these officers that are continuously growing, and they've created this culture where people are allowed to come to them and say, "Hey, you know what? You were wrong about something, and I want you to know about it." And that's that moment. You can either shoot the messenger, or you can go, "Okay, I'm about to have a learning moment, and I'm going to be a better leader on the backside of it." If you can swallow your pride long enough to listen.
Mm-hmm. I think that is definitely in the opportunities where I was part of a team or leading a team that was successful, it was because there was an environment of free speech, right? Of telling people, one, intellectually critiquing the work of what you're working on, right? Contributing as an equal member, regardless of rank or formal position. And the leader has to create that space for that to be okay. And then two, individuals who either have an error in self-awareness and they make some judgment, having that discussion and saying, hey, Bob, yesterday when this was happening, what were you thinking? Because you said this and that's unusual. Normally, and you can have this because that individual may not be aware that they had that error.
Yeah, so I think it applies not just to developing people into this cultural piece of it, but also there's a culture of thinking differently. The military has set processes for just about everything. And if we come up with a new problem, we'll come up with a new process for it immediately and we'll put it in doctrine. It may or may not be right, but we'll have one. But you and in Xundis, you guys have kind of cultivated this idea that the set processes may be useful as long as the environment around you is stable. But we don't live in a stable market. We don't live in a stable world. We live in a VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in a VUCA world, we've got to be able to change the way we think, not just change our minds about it, but change the way we approach problem solving. So I got to see this firsthand with you when we were in Special Operations Command together. But you have taken it to a whole nother level now with your company and helping to teach people in the private sector how to think differently. Help me understand that a little bit better, what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, one, we didn't invent anything, right? My business partner and I together, after our little foray into the commercial sector for 3 years after we retired, we decided, how can we use our many experiences? What do we think we learned that might be useful to other people outside of, the national security arena, right? Like, what do we actually have to offer? I don't have an MBA. I wasn't in corporate for 30 years. Like, I'm not going to try to be something I'm not. So what do we have? And as you experienced together when we worked together, at Special Operations, there was a time where we were confronted with pretty significant national security challenge in all of the things that we had been taught as military officers, you in the Army, I as a Marine, Navy. None of them gave us the pathway to get to a reasonable solution. For that matter, it didn't even give us a pathway to really fully understand what the issue was, right? Given previous experiences on recruiting duty and other thing, and then having an amazing group of intellectual giants, in my opinion, in one room, all working together, trying to question the efficacy of our own ideas, right? And our own institutions, for that matter. So that experience of 4 years for me really was impactful. And so when I entered the civilian sector, it was like, okay, how can I translate? Can't really share everything that happened, but what did I really learn, right? And it fundamentally goes back to the learn, unlearn, relearn. But that sounds easy. It's not so easy. And so at Xundis, what we do is we start with helping individuals become self-aware of their own bias, preferences, help them understand that the world is not black and white. Many people prefer it to be black and white, and they act as such. Because it's comfortable, right? Because then I'm in control and I know what I need to do. And as you said, we live in a VUCA world. So for some of the individuals, this is a pretty significant emotional event for them. They get to see the Matrix, I guess, if you refer back to that movie. Yeah. And they're like, oh my God, they feel like now the sky is falling. The next step is then to introduce them to a whole range of thinking tools in things that they can put in their toolkit to help them make sense of the matrix so that they can make better informed decisions for their organization and their personal life, whatever that may be. If you do it with organizational leaders, now you're driving the whole organization to be more self-aware and the whole organization to make better decisions. And this is everything from resharpening critical thinking skills, which most people have that, it's just under the surface. But really, creative thinking is something that as adults gets, unless you're one of the individuals who is overly passionate about art and are willing to be on the fringe of human society, right, as an artist or whatever, right, you generally pack away creative thinking skills. It's not rewarded. It's not incentivized, right? We try to bring that to the surface and demonstrate that creative and critical thinking work together, and those two things can help you explore complex issues. And there's a whole range of other ways that we introduce. So the sky's not falling. There's ways to deal with this VUCA world and be successful.
Yeah, I think the other component of that, and I know crisp thinking really helps address this, is you have the critical thinking to understand the problem, creative thinking to come up with novel solutions. But underlying that is the systemic thinking to really understand the context that problem is sitting in.
Oh, yes.
And I think there's a lack of conversation on that in the leadership world, that understanding how larger systems work and how they interact with each other is going to determine the level of complexity that you're dealing with. And just taking a problem in isolation, it works really well in a lab. But when you put it out in the real world, usually if it's in isolation, your solution to that problem is going to be the source of your next one.
Right. So. Well, I mean, look to most of the managed projects across industries. Like 75-80% of them fail for that very reason. It fails at the very upfront to recognize the broader context and other causal factors to whatever the thing is you're doing. Many of those things you can't control, perhaps, but you might be able to mitigate the effects of them. You might constrain those influences, but at least you're aware of them, so that as a human, when you're making decisions about why something is happening or not, you haven't oversimplified it to the degree where you believe you're in complete control.
I think that's a root of many, many problems in the world, is that people believe that they can be in control, even though they're sitting inside and operating within a complex adaptive system. Mm-hmm. And so this control piece is an illusion. And as soon as leaders get comfortable with the fact that they don't really control a whole lot, the better off they're going to be. But when they understand the rules of the system, right, as Shimon Nave would say, the logic of the system,
right?
If we understand that, then you might be able to influence it. You might be able to find those leverage points that have outsized impact on that system. And I think as organizational leaders, that would be an incredibly powerful skill to have.
Yeah, I think that it's funny that you mentioned Shimon. I agree with you, but I think if we go back to this, the way we're indoctrinated in school, right? We are led to believe that you can know everything. So I just need this is why I get a little bit nutty about the whole big data thing. Well, if I collect enough data and I have enough computing power, it's not complex anymore, and I can know everything. And you're like, no, you don't understand. You don't even know what to collect, because you don't even know there's invisible things that are influencing, the whole unknown is a real thing, which is why black swans, Nassim Taleb's black swans, are real. There's also, the black elephant, which is the thing that's in the room that you should see, but cognitively you don't. You can take the blinders off and you can determine that it's there and take some action. But I agree with you 1,000%. We spend a lot of time with our clients introducing the idea of complexity. What does that mean? How do those systems actually behave, and why? And then helping them understand that they can influence it and put constraints on that system to shape its behavior in a given context or time. But that takes energy, and so there's costs and benefits, and there's a whole new way to think about how to shape organizational behavior and outcomes.
So, Charlie, I could talk to you all day about this. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this, but thank you so much. I'm going to just quickly run down some of the lessons that I took from our conversation right now. First is that we've got to invest in people, right? Find the future in your ranks. Second, that leaders, I think everybody at every level, needs to learn, relearn, and unlearn as appropriate. I think there's a lot of value in the crisp thinking model of self-awareness, disrupting assumptions, and understanding first. And part of that is the ability to think in systems. So these are about developing mental tools and then creating the culture that you need to operate better in a VUCA world. And I think that it's not just about thinking. There's a cultural piece where people are willing to take risks and willing to try things in order to better understand your context and your operation. So if I could boil it down to two things, as leaders, we need to be deliberate about how we think and how we interact with people.
I agree. I would say leadership is culture making. And so the purpose of leadership is culture making, and that's what I speak to a lot ultimately. That's where I am as a leader. It's not about directing, guiding. At least organizational leaders, they influence that whole organization by creating a specific culture, and that the outcome of that culture is the performance of the organization.
Charlie, this has been amazing. I can't wait to grab a beer with you in the next couple of weeks as we come into the holiday season. This is always a pleasure to talk about leadership and to talk about how to think better. I love the phrase that leadership is culture making. I'm gonna steal that from you and post it up all over the place because I think you're spot on. Charlie, how's the people who are interested in learning more about crisp thinking or learning more about what Xundis does, how can they best get in touch with you?
They can contact us at partner@xundisglobal.com, XUNDIS global.com, and we'll have a conversation.
Love it. Thank you, sir. I always appreciate you sharing your wisdom with me and making me just a little bit smarter every day.
I feel the same way, Bob. Thanks.
All right. Take care.